What's the worst thing a rich kid got away with? I worked as a lifeguard at Oak Ridge Country Club during college. The members there weren't just rich. They were generational wealth rich. The kind where 16-year-olds drove cars worth more than my entire education. Mason Whitfield was the grandson of the club's founder. At 19, he'd already been kicked out of 3 private universities, each time with his family making a substantial donation to make the problems disappear. One night during a private member party, I caught Mason and his friends doing cocaine in the pool house. Club policy was clear: immediate expulsion and police notification for drugs. When I reported it to my manager, he looked terrified. "Just forget what you saw," he whispered. I refused and called the police myself. When they arrived 20 minutes later, the pool house had been cleaned spotless. The security footage for that time period was accidentally erased. 3 days later, I was fired for performance issues. 2 weeks after that, my mom lost her job at the elementary school where she'd taught for 15 years. My dad's contracting business suddenly lost all its local clients. I learned from a sympathetic server that Mr. Whitfield had made calls about my family. "Make sure they understand consequences," he'd said. We had to leave the town I'd grown up in. My parents sold our house at a loss. I had to drop out of college when my financial aid mysteriously fell through. 4 years later, I saw Mason's engagement announcement in the news. He's now a philanthropist and sits on the board of a children's charity. Sometimes I wonder if any of those children know who's really controlling their futures. But that's not where the story ends. That's just where it begins. You see, when you're 22 years old and watching your entire family's life crumble because you tried to do the right thing, it changes you. Not in some dramatic movie way where you become a vigilante or anything stupid like that. It changes you in quieter, deeper ways. It makes you understand that the world isn't fair, and sometimes the only justice you'll get is the kind you create for yourself. After we moved to Springfield, 3 hours away from everything I'd ever known, I spent a lot of time thinking. My parents tried to hide how broken they were, but I could see it. Dad would sit at the kitchen table with his laptop sending out bid proposals to contractors who would never call him back. Mom would grade papers for her new job at a public school that paid half what she used to make, and I'd catch her crying when she thought no one was looking. The worst part was how they never blamed me. Not once did either of them say, "Why couldn't you just keep your mouth shut?" But I could see it in their eyes sometimes. The question that hung in the air between us like smoke: was doing the right thing worth destroying 3 lives? I got a job at a local gym to help with bills, minimum wage, cleaning equipment, and checking people in. It was about as far from the pristine country club as you could get. The members here weren't driving Maseratis and discussing their third homes in the Hamptons. They were regular people trying to stay in shape after work, single moms squeezing in workouts between jobs, guys like my dad trying to maintain some dignity when everything else was falling apart. That's where I met Derek Chen. He was a journalist for the Springfield Tribune, which wasn't exactly the Washington Post, but he'd been investigating corruption in our area for years. Derek was one of those guys who looked completely ordinary: average height, glasses, drove a Honda Civic that had seen better days. But when he talked about his work, something intense flickered behind his eyes. We got to talking one evening after the gym closed. I was mopping floors and he was finishing up on the elliptical. "You're the Garrett kid, right?" he asked out of nowhere. "The family that moved here from Millbrook." I stopped mopping and looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Small town. Word gets around, especially when a whole family just picks up and leaves suddenly." He stepped off the machine and grabbed his towel. "I've heard some interesting stories about why you left." That conversation lasted until 2 a.m. in the empty gym. I told Derek everything: about Mason, the cocaine, the cover-up, how my family got systematically destroyed for my refusal to look the other way. Derek listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes on his phone. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "You know you're not the first, right?" "What do you mean?" "The Whitfields. This isn't their first time making problems disappear. I've been tracking stories like yours for 3 years now. You're just the first person willing to talk about it." That night, Derek showed me his research. Files and files of similar incidents going back decades. A teacher fired after reporting that Mason's uncle was having inappropriate relationships with students. A police officer transferred to desk duty after arresting Mason's cousin for drunk driving. A social worker who lost her license after investigating reports of abuse at a charity the Whitfields funded. Each story followed the same pattern. Someone tried to hold a Whitfield accountable. That person mysteriously faced professional consequences. Their families suffered. They either shut up and took it, or they left town. The thing about people with that kind of money, Derek explained, is they don't just buy their way out of problems. They buy silence. They buy complicity. They've turned corruption into an art form. I stared at the files spread across his kitchen table. Names, dates, testimonies, lives destroyed for trying to do what was right. Why hasn't anyone exposed this? Derek laughed, but there was no humor in it. With what platform? The local paper is owned by Whitfield Industries. The police chief plays golf with Mason's father every Thursday. The mayor's campaign was funded by Whitfield donations. He gestured at his modest apartment. "I'm a freelance journalist working for a paper that can barely afford to keep the lights on. Going up against that kind of power, it's career suicide." But as I looked at those files, at all those ruined lives, something hardened inside me. What if we had more evidence? What if we could prove a pattern? Derek studied my face. "What are you thinking?" I was thinking about my mom crying over her lesson plans, about my dad pretending he wasn't worried about making next month's rent, about Mason Whitfield sitting on charity boards, pretending to care about children while destroying families for sport. "I'm thinking," I said slowly, "that maybe it's time someone fought back." Over the next 6 months, Derek and I worked together to document everything we could find. We tracked down other victims, people who'd been scattered across the country after crossing the Whitfields. Most were too scared to talk at first, but gradually, we built a network of people who'd been waiting years for someone to listen to their stories. There was Maria Santos, a former hotel hotel manager who'd been fired after reporting that Mason's father was using underage staff for private parties. She'd moved to Phoenix and was working 3 jobs to support her kids. James Mitchell, a former city councilman who'd voted against a development project that would have benefited Whitfield Industries. His construction company had been mysteriously audited by the IRS 3 times in 2 years until he was forced to sell. Susan Wright, a former nurse who treated Mason after a car accident where he'd been driving drunk. When she'd noted alcohol on his breath in her report, she'd been accused of falsifying medical records and lost her license. Each person had the same story. They'd tried to do their job, follow the law, protect people. The Whitfields had destroyed them for it. But the more we dug, the more dangerous our investigation became. Derek started noticing cars following him. His editor at the Tribune suddenly became reluctant to publish his stories, claiming they needed more verification. Someone broke into his apartment, though nothing was stolen. Just a clear message that his files weren't as secure as he'd thought. Then they came after me. I'd been working at the gym for about 8 months when my manager Carl called me into his office. Carl was a good guy, former military, built like a tank but with the heart of a teddy bear. He'd given me the job when no one else would hire me, and he'd never asked questions about why my family had moved to Springfield so suddenly. "Sit down, Jake," he said, and I could tell from his voice that this wasn't going to be good news. "What's up?" Carl rubbed his face with his hands. He looked exhausted. "I got a call today from some lawyer representing Oak Ridge Country Club. Apparently you signed a non-disclosure agreement when you worked there." My blood went cold. "That's not true. I never signed anything like that." "I know, kid. I believe you. But they're threatening to sue me, the gym, everyone associated with you if you keep spreading false allegations about their members." Carl's hands were shaking slightly. "Jake, I can't afford a lawsuit. This place barely breaks even as it is." I felt that familiar sinking sensation, the same one I'd felt 4 years ago when everything started falling apart. "They're lying, Carl. I never signed anything. And I haven't been spreading allegations. I've just been talking to a journalist about what happened to me." "I know," Carl said quietly, "but it doesn't matter what's true. It matters what they can afford to prove in court." He looked away. "I'm sorry, Jake. I have to let you go." Walking out of that gym felt like reliving my worst nightmare. The same powerless feeling, the same realization that truth didn't matter when the other side had unlimited resources. But this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't a scared 22-year-old who thought the system would protect him. This time, I was angry. I called Derek immediately. "They're escalating. Carl just fired me because some lawyer claimed I signed an NDA. Jesus, are you okay?" "No, I'm not okay. I was walking down the street, not even sure where I was going. They're going to keep doing this. To me, to you, to anyone who tries to expose them. We have to do something bigger. Jake, I know you're angry, but we can't let emotion drive our decisions here. We need to be smart about this." "Smart?" I laughed bitterly. "Derek, being smart is what got us here. Playing by the rules, following proper channels, trying to build a case the right way. Meanwhile, they're destroying people's lives with phone calls." That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to get the evidence we needed, no matter what it took. The Whitfields were hosting their annual charity gala in 2 weeks. It was always held at Oak Ridge Country Club, and it was always a massive event. Politicians, judges, business leaders, everyone who mattered in the region would be there, including Mason. I knew the layout of that club better than almost anyone. I'd worked there for 2 years, and I'd memorized every entrance, every security camera, every blind spot. If there was evidence of the Whitfields' corruption, it would be in the club's administrative offices, financial records, correspondence, maybe even recordings of the phone calls that had destroyed so many lives. Derek thought I was crazy. "Jake, that's breaking and entering. If you get caught, they'll throw you in prison, and anything you find won't be admissible in court anyway." "I'm not trying to build a court case anymore," I told him. "I'm trying to build a story that's so big, so public, that they can't make it disappear." The plan was simple in concept, terrifyingly complex in execution. During the gala, when everyone would be focused on the party, I'd slip into the administrative wing of the club. I'd copy whatever files I could find, photograph documents, and get out before anyone noticed. I spent 2 weeks preparing. I studied the club's security systems, timed the guards' patrols, even drove by the place multiple times to watch how they set up for big events. I bought a cheap tablet with a good camera and practiced taking clear photos of documents in low light. The night of the gala, I waited until the party was in full swing before making my move. I parked 3 blocks away and approached the club through the golf course, staying in the shadows between holes. The sounds of music and laughter drifted across the perfectly manicured grounds. Getting inside was easier than I'd expected. I knew about a service entrance that the kitchen staff used for deliveries, and I still had my old key card. Apparently, they'd never bothered to deactivate it when they fired me 4 years ago. The administrative wing was on the 2nd floor, away from the party. I took the service stairs, my heart pounding so loud I was sure someone would hear it. The hallways were dimly lit, with only emergency lighting to guide me. Mason's grandfather's office was at the end of the hall. Charles Whitfield had been dead for 5 years, but the family kept his office exactly as he'd left it, like some kind of shrine to their dynasty. If there were records of the family's dirty dealings, they'd be there. The door was locked, but I'd expected that. I'd spent hours on YouTube learning to pick locks, practicing on cheap padlocks until I could do it in under a minute. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries, but finally the lock clicked open. Charles Whitfield's office was exactly as I remembered it from the few times I'd been inside during my employment. Dark wood paneling, leather furniture, and a massive desk that probably cost more than most people's cars. But what I was looking for was the filing cabinets behind the desk. I started photographing documents as quickly as I could. Financial records, correspondence, meeting notes. Most of it was boring corporate stuff, but then I found a file labeled personnel issues. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold. There were detailed profiles of everyone who'd ever caused problems for the Whitfields. Photos, personal personal information, financial records, family details. My file was there, along with my parents' information. So were files on Derek, Maria Santos, James Mitchell, Susan Wright, and dozens of others. But the worst part was the notes. Handwritten instructions on how to neutralize threats, phone numbers for lawyers, private investigators, politicians, even instructions on how to manufacture evidence against troublemakers. I was photographing as fast as I could when I heard footsteps in the hallway. My blood turned to ice. The footsteps were getting closer, and I was trapped in an office at the end of a dead-end hallway. I shoved the files back into the cabinet and looked around desperately for somewhere to hide. The office had a large closet, and I managed to slip inside just as I heard voices outside the door. Through the crack, I could see someone trying the door handle. "It's locked," a voice said. I recognized it immediately. "Mason Whitfield. Are you sure you left the documents in here?" Another voice, older, probably Mason's father. "Positive. The contracts for the Springfield development are in grandfather's desk. I need them for the morning meeting." I heard the sound of keys, and then the door opened. Light flooded the office as they turned on the overheads. I pressed myself against the back of the closet, trying to control my breathing. Through the crack in the closet door, I could see Mason and his father moving around the office. Mason looked exactly the same as he had 4 years ago. Still the same arrogant posture, the same expensive suit, the same complete confidence that the world belonged to him. "Here they are," his father said, pulling papers from the desk. "Robert did good work on this one. That zoning commissioner never knew what hit him." Mason laughed. "Blackmail really is an art form. You should have seen his face when we showed him those photos. Your grandfather would be proud. He always said that information was more valuable than money." Mason's father looked around the office with something like reverence. He built this empire by understanding that everyone has secrets. Speaking of secrets, Mason said, "What's the status on that journalist? The one who's been asking questions about our family? Derek Chen. He's been handled. His editor killed his story, and we've made it clear that any publication printing his allegations will face serious legal consequences." "And the lifeguard, the one who started all this?" Mason's father smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen. "Jake Garrett. He lost his job at the gym last week. His father's business is struggling, and his mother's new school district is facing budget cuts. They'll get the message soon enough. Maybe we should send a clearer message," Mason suggested. "Remember what happened to that social worker who got too nosy about our charity work?" Now, his father said, but he was still smiling. "We're civilized people. We don't need to resort to violence when financial pressure works just as well." They gathered their documents and headed for the door. "Besides," Mason's father added, "if Mr. Garrett keeps pushing, we can always arrange for him to have legal troubles. A drug possession charge, maybe some tax issues." Amazing how quickly troublemakers disappear when they're fighting for their freedom. They turned off the lights and left, locking the door behind them. I waited in that closet for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. When I finally crept out, my legs were so stiff I could barely walk, but I had what I came for, more than I'd ever hoped to find. The photographs I'd taken were explosive, not just evidence of individual cases of corruption, but proof of an entire systematic operation designed to destroy anyone who crossed the Whitfield family. Names, dates, methods, even financial records showing payments to corrupt officials. But as I made my way out of the club, I realized that having the evidence was only half the battle. The Whitfields had made it clear that they owned the local media, the police, even the courts. How do you expose corruption when the entire system is designed to protect the corrupt? The answer came to me as I was driving home. Social media. The old rules didn't apply anymore. You didn't need newspapers or TV stations to reach people. You just needed the internet and a story compelling enough to go viral. Derek was initially skeptical when I showed him the photographs. "This is incredible evidence, Jake, but we still need to be careful about how we release it. If we do this wrong, they'll destroy us and bury the story. Then we don't give them the chance," I said. "We release everything at once, on every platform we can think of. Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. We make it impossible to contain. And then what? You think posting on social media is gonna bring down a family with this much power?" I looked at the photographs spread across Derek's kitchen table. All those lives destroyed, all those people who'd given up hope of ever getting justice. Maybe not, but at least people will know the truth, and maybe that's enough. We spent the next week preparing our release strategy. Derek wrote a comprehensive article documenting everything we'd discovered. I created accounts on every social media platform I could think of. We contacted every journalist, blogger, and activist we could find who might be interested in the story. The plan was to release everything simultaneously on a Friday evening when social media usage was at its peak and when it would be harder for the Whitfields to coordinate a response over the weekend. But the night before our planned release, something happened that changed everything. I was at my parents' house, helping my dad with some paperwork for his struggling business, when we heard a car pull into the driveway. Through the window, I could see a black sedan with tinted windows. Two men in expensive suits got out and walked toward our front door. My dad opened the door before they could knock. "Can I help you?" The older of the two men smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Garrett, we're here to talk to your son. We represent certain parties who believe he may have some information that belongs to them." I stepped up beside my dad. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't," the man said pleasantly. "Perhaps we could come inside and discuss this privately." "I don't think so," my dad said firmly. "If you have business with my son, you can conduct it right here." The second man spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Mr. Garrett, we understand you've been having some financial difficulties lately. Your contracting business, your wife's reduced salary. It's a shame when good people struggle through no fault of their own." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. My mother appeared behind us, and I could see the fear in her eyes. These people had already destroyed us once. They were here to finish the job. "What do you want?" I asked. The older man reached into his jacket and pulled out a tablet. On the screen were photographs of Derek and me at various locations locations around town, entering Derek's apartment, sitting in coffee shops, even walking through the park where we'd met to discuss our investigation. "We want you to stop," he said simply. "We want you to forget whatever you think you've discovered, and we want you to convince your journalist friend to do the same. And if we don't," the man's smile got wider. "Well, that would be unfortunate for all of you." He handed me a business card with nothing but a phone number on it. "You have 24 hours to consider our offer. We'll be in touch." They walked back to their car and drove away, leaving us standing in the doorway. My parents looked terrified, and I felt that familiar rage building inside me again. But this time, the rage was mixed with something else. Determination. "Pack a bag," I told my parents. "We're leaving. Tonight." "Jake, what's going on?" my mother asked. "I'm going to tell you everything," I said. "But first, we need to get somewhere safe." We drove to Derek's apartment, and I called him on the way. "We have a problem. They know about tomorrow." "What do you mean they know?" "I mean 2 guys in suits just threatened my family." "We're blown, Derek. They know everything." When we got to Derek's place, I could see he'd already been packing. "I've been thinking the same thing," he said. "My editor called this afternoon. Apparently the Tribune is killing my story due to credibility concerns." We sat around Derek's kitchen table, my parents, Derek and me, and I finally told my mom and dad everything. About the investigation, about what we'd discovered, about the photographs from Charles Whitfield's office. My mother cried when she realized how deep the corruption went. My father just sat quietly, his hands clenched into fists. "So what do we do now?" my dad asked finally. "We release everything," I said. "Tonight, right now, before they can stop us." "Jake, if you do this, there's no going back," Derek warned. "They'll come after all of us with everything they have." "They're already coming after us," I pointed out. "At least this way, we go down fighting." Over the next 4 hours, we uploaded everything we had to every platform we could think of. Derek's article went live on a blog he'd created specifically for this purpose. I posted the photographs and documents on Reddit with detailed explanations of what each one proved. We created YouTube videos, Twitter threads, Facebook posts. We sent copies to journalists across the country, to activist organizations, to anyone who might amplify the story. By 3 a.m., we were exhausted but oddly exhilarated. We'd done it. The truth was out there, scattered across the internet like seeds in the wind. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, our Reddit post had thousands of upvotes and hundreds of comments. People were sharing the story across social media platforms faster than we could track. Journalists from national publications were reaching out for interviews. The hashtag #Whitfield Files was trending on Twitter, but the Whitfield's response was swift and brutal. By noon the next day, Derek had received a cease and desist order claiming copyright infringement on the documents we'd published. Several of the social media platforms had removed our posts, citing violations of community standards. The blog hosting Derek's article had taken it down after receiving legal threats, but it was too late. The story had already spread too far to contain. Other people had saved copies of our evidence and were reposting it faster than the Whitfield's lawyers could issue takedown notices. News outlets were starting to pick up the story, and some of the victims we'd interviewed were coming forward publicly to share their experiences. That's when things got really dangerous. 2 days after our release, Derek's apartment was broken into. This time, they took everything. His computers, his files, even his backup drives. When he called the police, they seemed remarkably uninterested in investigating. My parents received a letter from the IRS announcing a routine audit of their finances. My mom got a call from her principal saying that there had been complaints about her teaching performance and that her contract might not be renewed. But the worst was yet to come. I was staying at a motel outside of town, afraid to go home, when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. Jake Garrett. The voice was calm, professional. "Who is this?" "Someone who's very disappointed in your recent activities. You were given a chance to walk away from this situation, and you chose not to take it." I felt my chest tighten. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand something. Your little internet campaign has been amusing, but it ends now. Tomorrow morning, you're going to post a retraction. You're going to admit that you fabricated evidence, that you broke into private property, that everything you've claimed about the Whitfield family is a lie." "I'm not doing that." The voice remained calm. "Oh, but you are. Because if you don't, some very interesting evidence is going to emerge about your activities. Drug possession, breaking and entering, maybe even evidence that you've been stalking the Whitfield family for years. That's not true. Truth is such a flexible concept, don't you think? Especially when you have the right lawyers and the right connections." The voice paused. "You have until tomorrow morning to make your choice. Choose wisely, Mr. Garrett." The line went dead. I sat in that motel room, staring at my phone, and I realized that we were at a crossroads. I could back down, issue the retraction, and maybe they'd leave what was left of my family alone, or I could keep fighting and risk losing everything. But then I thought about all the people whose stories we'd uncovered. Maria Santos, working 3 jobs in Phoenix. James Mitchell, whose business had been destroyed. Susan Wright, who'd lost her nursing license for telling the truth. All the people who'd been waiting years for someone to fight back. I called Derek. "They want me to issue a retraction. What are you going to do?" I looked out the motel window at the parking lot, at the normal people living normal lives, people who had no idea that families like the Whitfields even existed. "I'm going to do the opposite." The next morning, instead of issuing a retraction, I doubled down. I posted a video on YouTube explaining exactly what the Whitfields had threatened to do to me. I detailed their systematic campaign of intimidation and destruction. I challenged them to sue me, to arrest me, to do whatever they thought they could get away with. The video went viral within hours. Suddenly, I wasn't just a voice in the wilderness anymore. Other victims started coming forward with their stories. Journalists who'd been afraid to investigate the Whitfields found their courage. Political opponents who'd been silenced for years started speaking up. The story became bigger than any of us had imagined. What started as one young man's quest for justice had become a national conversation about corruption, power, and the way wealthy wealthy families could destroy lives with impunity. Of course, the Whitfields didn't go down without a fight. I was arrested 3 days later on charges of breaking and entering, theft, and criminal harassment. The evidence against me was substantial. Security footage that allegedly showed me entering the country club, fingerprints on documents in Charles Whitfield's office, even testimony from witnesses who claimed I'd been stalking Mason Whitfield for years. But something had changed. The story was too big now, too public for the usual tactics to work. Civil rights lawyers offered to represent me pro bono. Journalists camped outside the courthouse. Protesters held signs demanding justice. During my arraignment, something unprecedented happened. The prosecutor stood up and announced that, after further investigation, the state was dropping all charges against me. The evidence, he claimed, had been compromised and couldn't be authenticated. Later, I learned what had really happened. Federal investigators had been watching the Whitfields for months, building a case for tax evasion and corruption charges. Our social media campaign had provided them with the final pieces of evidence they needed. Within 6 months, Charles Whitfield Jr., Mason's father, was indicted on federal corruption charges. Mason himself was arrested for drug possession and bribery. Several local officials who'd been in the Whitfields' pocket were forced to resign. The family's empire didn't collapse overnight, but it began to crumble. Businesses distanced themselves from Whitfield Industries. Charitable organizations returned donations. The carefully constructed network of power and influence that had protected them for generations started to fall apart. As for me, I never got my old life back. My family couldn't return to Millbrook. Too much had happened. Too many bridges had been burned. But we didn't need to. The story of our fight against the Whitfields had opened doors that we'd never imagined. I was offered book deals, speaking engagements, even movie rights. Derek got a job with a major newspaper, and his reporting on corruption won several awards. My parents were able to rebuild their lives with dignity intact. But the most satisfying moment came 2 years later, when I saw Mason Whitfield for the last time. I was giving a speech at a conference about corruption and accountability when someone in the audience asked about the long-term consequences of our investigation. As I was answering, I noticed a familiar figure in the back of the room. Mason looked different. Older, obviously, but also smaller somehow. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. He was wearing a cheap suit instead of the designer clothes I remembered, and he kept looking around nervously, as if expecting to be recognized. After my speech, he approached me in the hallway. "Jake Garrett," he said quietly. I turned to face him. "Mason, I wanted to apologize for what my family did to you, to your parents. It was wrong." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity, but all I saw was exhaustion and what looked like genuine remorse. "Apology accepted," I said finally. He nodded and started to walk away, then turned back. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't give up. My family needed to be stopped." I watched him disappear into the crowd, and I realized that this was what justice looked like. Not perfect, not complete, but real. The powerful had been held accountable. The victims had been heard. The truth had won, eventually. Sometimes people ask me if it was worth it. If fighting back against the Whitfields was worth the years of struggle, the fear, the damage to my family. It's a complicated question with a complicated answer. Was it worth it to see Mason's father in handcuffs? Yes. Was it worth it to give other victims a voice? Absolutely. Was it worth it to prove that even the most powerful families aren't above the law? Without question. But was it worth watching my parents lose everything they'd worked for? Was it worth the nights I couldn't sleep, looking over my shoulder, wondering if the next car following me was just coincidence? Was it worth becoming someone whose life was defined by a single moment of moral courage? That's harder to answer. What I can say is this: I learned that sometimes doing the right thing costs everything you have, but I also learned that sometimes it's worth paying that price, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. The Whitfields were stopped, not completely, not permanently, but stopped nonetheless. Other families like them saw what happened and realized that their money and power couldn't protect them from the truth forever. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's what justice looks like in the real world. Not perfect, not complete, but real enough to matter. Today, I work as an investigative consultant, helping other people who've been victimized by powerful interests. Derek and I still collaborate on stories, though we're more careful now about security and safety. My parents have found peace in their new life, though they still wake up sometimes checking to make sure their doors are locked. Mason Whitfield works at a non-profit now, apparently trying to make amends for his family's legacy. I don't know if his transformation is genuine or just another form of image management, but I choose to believe that people can change, because if they can't, then what was any of this for? The last thing I'll say is this: if you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, where you have to choose between doing what's right and doing what's safe, remember that you're not alone. There are more good people in the world than bad ones, and when the chips are down, they'll stand with you. It might not feel that way at first. It might feel like you're fighting impossible odds with no hope of winning, but the truth has a way of finding the light, even when powerful people try to bury it in darkness. Sometimes that's enough to change everything. The rich kid didn't get away with it in the end. None of them did. And sometimes that's exactly the justice the world needs.